Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Anti-Forensics, Reverse Engineering, a leading phone forensics tool. My name is Matt Bergin. I'm a vulnerability researcher and exploit developer for CoreLogic Security. I've released a little over 55 security advisories in the last 10 years, and today I'm going to talk to you about 3 of them. So what are we going to talk about? Well, first, when I started this project, my first question was, what is a Cellebrite UFED? So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll also talk about some of the work that has been done previously, how I went about acquiring targets, how Cellebrite implements some of their methodologies, and then I'll get into some of what my research actually consisted of, which was getting privileged access to a device, establishing a debugging environment, reverse engineering some of what their tools do, and finding some problems that I could report. After that, I'll talk about some of the general concerns that I have overall, and I'll even demo a method that you may be able to use to defend yourself. And then I'll close with some future work that I'll be looking into. So what is a Cellebrite UFED? Well, what you see is pretty much what you get. They claim that it can unlock pretty much any phone, and that was really interesting to me. It's designed to recover information from encrypted devices, remove authentication, read application data, and it actually, some of their products even work on drones, which is a lesser known use case, but also pretty cool. So when I first started looking into this, I basically Googled pretty deep. And what I found was kind of like 2 sides of the coin. It's an honorable goal, right? Like forensics tool makers, they want to help law enforcement solve crimes and bring justice to victims. And forensic evidence undoubtedly helps solve crimes. More information for investigators means that leads in cases are established easier and relevant information can be uncovered more quickly. I'm sure these tools have helped law enforcement solve investigations much easier if they didn't otherwise have them. With that said, though, it's like I said, it's both sides of the coin. When you start putting stuff like this into Google, you see the good with the bad. Groups like Human Rights Watch, Privacy International, EFF, ACLU, and a lot of others who agree in some way, shape, or form that government hacking is harmful, and not just in the United States, but worldwide. Recently, there was even a court petition filed against Cellebrite for selling their products to Hong Kong, and they actually just recently stopped selling their products because of that lawsuit to Hong Kong. But they're still used pretty much all over the world. In fact, here, if we look at this next slide, there, bottom left or bottom right hand corner, I typed in Cellebrite UFED to Google Trends and got kind of an idea of where these tools are being used at, or at least where they're being searched for. And it ended up not just being the United States, they're kind of used everywhere. But inside of the United States, they're really prevalent. For example, the Department of Homeland Security in 2019 spent $35 million on acquiring Cellebrite UFEDs for their different agencies under their umbrella. The Secret Service in that same year spent $500,000 on Cellebrite UFEDs, and even at the local and city level, the city of Beverly Hills spent just over $50,000 on Cellebrite UFEDs. So they're pretty much used everywhere, and they're pretty pricey. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. So the historical work, I'm not the first person to look into these. You can see the bottom right-hand corner, someone's even got Doom to run on one, which I think is pretty cool. But there's been other people who've talked about these products previously, not just in blogs or whatnot. They've had presentations on them. And they've even had some very similar research to what I've done also being done previously before, which I wish I would have known at the time that I started this, but I found it out later on, which was unfortunate. But before I could do anything, I had to get my hands on some of these. So I had to acquire some targets, right? So I turned to eBay. eBay worked out really well. Because these devices are sold worldwide, there's a massive marketplace for them. And there are two different kinds that you can play with: consumer grade, which is used by your cell phone shops, your cell providers. And then obviously there's this law enforcement side, this UFED side as well. On eBay, I found that the cost was anywhere between $100 to $2,500. Brand new, you're looking between $9,000 and $18,000 per unit, with a renewal cost of somewhere between $3,500 and $15,000 per year. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, it might be a little difficult to see, but the license in the one that is on the screen is in 2025, so it's still valid, and that's $1,500 British pounds, so that's $2,000 USD. So for $2,000, you can get something that's current and still download updates for, presumably. So this is the route that I went. I ended up acquiring 5 or 6 different of these devices. So this is kind of some screenshots that I found, give you an idea of what the user interface kind of looks like. The top left-hand corner is the UFED device itself. On the bottom right-hand corner is an alternative product called UFED for PC, which is basically the same thing. It's just for your regular laptop. You might need a USB hub for it, I'm not sure. But it's just standard laptop installation. And then the two opposing corners are the different selection screens, depending on what kind of target you're going after there. So some of the methodologies that they implement, UFED for PC has just over 31,000 different profiles to extract data from devices that can be split up between logical, we'll talk a little bit about the difference more later, but logical, file system, physical, and lock bypass. It supports data extraction for almost 11,000 applications, and it supports passcode removal for around 5,500 applications. And that really is anything from your private messaging applications like Signal and Threema to your web browsers, your social media applications, your Uber, or your dating applications like your Tinder and your Grindr. How do they actually extract information? Well, the most successful way of doing it and the most forensically sound way of doing it is by leveraging an exploit against a bootloader. There are a couple different options that they heavily rely on to do that. Now, I can't say if these particular exploits were already publicly known and then Cellebrite later implemented them in their product, or if they were originally identified from people working for Cellebrite and then later discovered by other individuals in the information security industry. I'm not sure what the timeline is on some of those, but these are definitely heavily relied upon exploits that are used by the UFED product. So once it's been exploited, then they can then boot custom images, which either disable lock protections or enable other attacks against encrypted partitions. This is what I had access to as a couple years older. So there was nothing that was really new that was listed in the content that I had access to at the time. But I did see some pretty interesting things. The most interesting thing was probably the decrypting bootloaders for Samsung, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. If your Cellebrite UFED device cannot exploit the target for some reason, they have a services team, and the services team, you can send them the target device that you want to compromise, and they'll run some private exploits that they keep behind the curtain, so to speak, for you, and then send that unlocked device back to you. They post on their website what targets or what phones they can compromise and what methods, kind of what they can use. If it's compromising a device or decrypting a device based off of a brute force attack, or if no brute force is required and only the device needs to be powered on and kept powered on after seizure, And then it just kind of can bypass that whole decryption part because it's already, the key material is already stored in memory of the running device. So if you can't unlock it for some reason, you can ship your phone off to them, or your target's phone off to them, and they'll do it for you. So how did I get system? Well, they try to lock you into this jailed environment, right, where you're not allowed to access Task Manager or a lot of things from the start menu, and you're not allowed to pull open the Windows Explorer, yada yada. They do that through group policy, and there are obvious ways around that. Like you need to be able to connect to the internet, right? So one thing that I found is that when you're connecting to a wireless network, if you selected certificate-based authentication, you get a file dialog that you can then, very similar to a Citrix escape, if any of you are familiar with that, you can then drag and drop files over cmd.exe, traversing the file system, obviously, to system 32, and pop open a CMD prompt that way. From there, I had access to the USB ports on the device because they obviously want you to be able to move evidence to and from the Cellebrite. So I just moved over a interpreter payload and had it connect back to a C2 that I had set up. And then I had set up a port forward via the C2 to the loopback interface on the Cellebrite UFED and delivered Eternal Blue escalating to system. Once I had that, all I needed to do there was just add myself a local admin account that I could then begin to set up my actual debugging environment through. So here's a picture of what that looked like. This little cheap $6, $9, I don't remember what it was, Motorola phone is what I use to do basically all of my research with. I've got the Cellebrite sitting at a debugger on the SHA-256 function from a common.dll file that they use. The debugger is OllyDebug. The phone is powered by an SMD rework station, and it's just got some duct tape to hold the things in place. But I use the debugger to, I use several plugins in the debugger rather to help my research process. OllyScript to help the deobfuscation of some of the Themeda stuff that was going on and dumping the IAT and rebuilding the actual DLLs. Strong OD to kind of hide from things, and Phantom to also hide from things as well. They do protect the actual application with Themeda. I won't get into breaking Themeda because that's kind of its own hairy process. But I will say I didn't use anything that was custom or new. I researched other ways that people had already broken it, and I implemented those ways here. So reversing EPRs. So what is an EPR? EPR is basically a zip. It's an encrypted zip file. That's all it is. Inside of the encrypted zip is stuff that they use, exploits, applications that they'll install on the target device, things like that, bootloaders, etc. So they're basically just encrypted containers. And the very first version was broken by somebody else, and I broke it and then realized that somebody else had already broken it. It was a hassle, but it ended up being good because version 2 was very similar to version 1, and all of the reversing knowledge from version 1 ended up applying very well to my reversing of the version 2 that I played with. So how did I go about setting up, and what ended up working, what didn't work, right? So each vendor had an EPR file. So right, you had one EPR file for Motorola, you had another EPR file for whatever vendor, and then things that applied generically had another EPR file. All of the decryption process happens in memory. It doesn't rely on a standard library. They implemented it on themselves, but it is just a standard AES 256 CBC implementation. I tried 2 different approaches. I tried hooking their libraries and making calls directly into them. I had some success with this, but I wasn't making progress as fast as I wanted to make. So I ended up switching it up. And I just started reversing and looking at the debugging calls and trying to recreate those calls myself. And that ended up working out the best for me there. So version 1, like I said, it was previously cracked by somebody else. In 2017, Cellebrite was hacked. They lost about 1 terabyte of data. That same person presumably also cracked the EPR encryption and published their methodology online. I went through the whole process and found that later, which, yeah. But really, it was pretty simple. The AES key and IV were hard-coded into a DLL. And the key and IV never changed. It was pretty obvious what the key was, but they wrapped that string into the SHA-256 function and then used the SHA-256 as the key. You really just pull that stuff out of the DLL directly if you wanted to, and then set up your decryptor that way. There was in the EPR itself, there was a header, and you could discard that header, and then everything after was encrypted with that key material. The header was removed in the next version. And the key and the IV were always the same. So vendor A, vendor B, generic code, always the same key material. Version 2 was a nice increase in complexity, and they changed up how the decryption process worked a little bit. Still happened in memory, still a process that they implemented, not a standard library, but it's still just AES 256 CBC, just something that they had written. The initial AES key and IV were hard-coded into a DLL, but this time you use that hard-coded key material to then decrypt the next key and the next IV, and then you use that the next key there to decrypt another binary blob, which was 2 D words that you XORed together. And the result from that XOR would be the ending D word of a SHA-256, calculated based off of bytes in memory, or in a DLL. So you would iterate over 256 bytes using 64 bytes at a time to calculate a SHA-256. It's total like, I think 8. And one of those, the bytes calculating that SHA-256 would end up being the next key material used to decrypt the final key, NIE and IV key pair. And then once you had that third and final key, you can then decrypt the remainder of the bytes from byte 128 and on using blocks of 65,036 or 536. And you'll end up with a decrypted zip. Version 3 was basically the exact same as version 2 that I saw. They did change the 256 bytes. That's kind of the key map that they iterate over in 64 bytes at a time. But that was really it. That was the only change there. So what does it look like when you actually decrypt? Well, here you go. So top left-hand corner is my decryptor in operation. I pulled back I redacted the key in IV, the final key in IV, but the rest of it included. On the right-hand side is the unzipping of the archive that was decrypted. And you can see there's some APKs, some exploits like Dirty Cow, Ping Root, which is kind of an older one, Zerg Rush, which is even older than that, and then some dumpers like NAND Read and NAND Pi, NAND Read Static, which are some of the tools they rely on for dumping file systems. All right, so let's talk about what I found. Some of the tools that they use on devices that are being extracted. Probably the most interesting one is called KnockoutN. KnockoutN is a tool that is a post-exploitation toolkit, which is heavily relied on. It facilitates different kind of access to the device depending upon what the template that the user configures to be used. For example, you can build an image that will load ADB with no authentication requirements. You can use it to automatically run an extraction of NAND that's on the device. Or you can use it how it's kind of shown on the left or the right-hand side, where you brute force encrypted partitions. And an interesting thing here on line, where is it? 104, the call to fgets it's limited to hex 20, which is 32 characters. So if your password is 32 characters long, the fgets your password definitely will not fall in the fgets call, and they won't be able to brute force your password. Little tidbit there. What else do they use? Mr. Mee See. Mr. Mee See is a reference to a cartoon called Rick and Morty. A Mee See is designed to accomplish a task for you and then go away. And that's really what it does here. It's designed to help automate the process of evidence collection by running binaries or performing tasks. And when it's finished, it's designed to automatically kill itself. You can see on the bottom right-hand corner, it'll start an intent that's designed to remove itself. So just like a Mee See well, once it's finished up, it'll go away, like a good Mee See. There's also Alohomora. Alohomora is a reference to Harry Potter. It's a magical spell in Harry Potter that is used to unlock locks. It does seem like a fitting name, given the feature that it's designed to be. Publicly facing, they call this feature lockup, and I don't know a whole lot about how it works. It's probably the most under-researched portion of this project that I have, but it is cool. I have seen it, I've used it, and it does work. How it does it, I'm not sure, but it's part of my future work that I'm going to be looking into. So on to some of the things that I found that I wanted to have addressed. This is probably the biggest of them. Cellebrite RSA and the ADB daemon. ADB is the Android debug bridge. It lets the Cellebrite device sideload applications like Mr. Mee See, for example. It allows them to upload and download files from the device. They can drop a shell on the device, so on and so forth. That's kind of the idea of what ADB is designed to be. And they use it, obviously, to help collect evidence. The person, when you plug it in and it starts to get used, the interface tells you to permanently trust the keys. At least it did. I don't know if that is still the case or not, but it did at one time tell you to permanently accept those keys and to trust them. So I thought a quick and easy test would be, I had 4 or 5 of these devices, and when I bought them, I also bought like 40 different Motorola devices that I could just easily plug in. So I had a lot of different devices, and I decided a quick and easy test would be to plug them in. Plug different phones into the same device, and then plug that same phone into a different Cellebrite device, and see what would happen. And to my surprise, 2 Cellebrites gave the same fingerprint when authenticating via ADB. And I didn't even need to bust out a disassembler to know what that meant. It meant that both Cellebrites had the same private key material used to authenticate to ADB. So I did it to a 3rd one and the same fingerprint. So now I said, all right, well, there's clearly something I want to look into. So I pulled up on the disassembler and I looked at how their client was designed. And I found that the keys were hard-coded inside of a DLL that they were then being called into and used to authenticate. And they were hard-coded in the DLL. So I knew what that meant. That meant that every Cellebrite had these. If you were running that version of software, you had these keys. And I also found that those keys go back quite a far ways as well. So there were 3 keys that were inside of the UFED software. And there was another key that you could find alongside the KnockoutN client as well. And they were hard-coded. All of them were hard-coded. So like theoretically, right, just copy the keys out of the DLLs and you're good to go. So that's the way that I ended up going. You could have also done another way of hooking the crypt import key and then extracting the memory passed to that function. But either way, since the keys are stored in MS Keyblob, you had to convert them over to PIM. Once you had that, though, then you could basically pretend to be the UFEDs. So what does that get you? Well, a design like this makes it possible for someone to plant evidence on a device with plausible attribution that it was a UFED having connected and not a malicious actor doing something naughty. Now, obviously, it's not just that easy. An actual malicious actor would need to stomp on the file metadata to place the target device in possession of a suspect individual, or potentially other considerations that would need to be made as well. From an operational perspective, though, the exploits that you would need to do this, to make these changes, they're all there. They're all provided right alongside their software, and obviously you can decrypt their stuff and get to them. With that, like, with all of this in mind, I started having other questions, right? Like, what about 0 days? You know, should we use 0 days for law enforcement? Well, I'd be lying if I said I knew the right answer, but I have worked with enough 0 days to know that each one that isn't patched exposes us a little, and sometimes a lot. The same exploits used to collect evidence from a suspected murderer are the same kind that our foreign adversaries can use against us, and some may even be for the same vulnerabilities we're relying on for law enforcement. With over 50 public security advisories that I've released, it takes both hands to count the number of times I've gotten an email from someone saying they'd known about the vulnerability that I had just published. The implied secrecy of a 0 day is just not nearly as effective as you would think. More often than not, you're not the only person who knows about any particular vulnerability. So how do you balance the public risk versus reward? Well, I don't envy the people involved in the process, but we do have a process. It itself has some flaws, but we do have a process. The vulnerability equities process, policy and process, some of the issues that I see with it is that in my reading, it only applies to vulnerabilities discovered by the US government. So presumably, when law enforcement reaches out to a third party like CAS, and CAS unlocks that device using exploits that they keep behind the curtain, so to speak, those vulnerabilities are not being processed or not being governed by the VET process that exists now. And the vulnerabilities which do fall under the VET's jurisdiction, Part 2A and Part 2B of Appendix B, they basically act as a catch-all for continued use until they're no longer effective. Some vulnerabilities can live for years. That's a problem. That creates risk for everybody. And finally, the annual report is classified, so we don't have any real public understanding of how many vulnerabilities are falling under the VEP's jurisdiction, and of those, how many are actually being eventually disclosed to the affected vendors so that they may be remedied. Supposedly, the executive summary is not classified, but I've tried to find one and I've been unable to do so. Cellebrite specific issues, though, we reported kind of what we've talked about here today to them. And although they disagreed with the risk case presented, they also produced and distributed patches for all of the issues that we brought up. Surely things like this should have been caught before, though, right? Why should forensics examiners in other countries have access to the same key material used to image devices inside of the United States? Before our disclosures, that was the case, going back to at least March of 2016 and in all likelihood earlier than that. Well, this got me wondering whether or not forensics tools like these have to comply with any kind of minimum standards or accreditation process. And the short answer is they don't. We do have the CFTT. The CFTT is a testing program from NIST that validates that tools function as their features describe. That is, if a device is advertised as being able to extract Instagram messages on a Samsung 10 running Android 11, they'll build a test case that validates as much. Nothing in the methodology, though, calls for the type of testing that we've talked about today. I'd call it adversarial testing. CFTT does seem like a great framework to extend this type of testing into, though. It produces valid findings as it is now, and extending it while also adopting legislation that requires tools like these undergo and pass tests, which include the type of adversarial attacks we've talked about, would provide the ability to regulate and enforce standards on these tools. I think that's good for everybody. I think it's good for everyone from the forensic analysts and prosecutors who rely on these tools to collect evidence, all the way to those who have been accused of a crime. I believe the way that any process is implemented to acquire forensic evidence should be publicly known and freely available for scrutiny. In the United States, the accused have a Sixth Amendment right to confront their accusers. That should extend to information about the way data are gathered for use in criminal investigations. The core issue is that every citizen should have the right to cross-examine the evidence acquired, the origin of the process used to acquire it, the acquisition process itself, how acquired data were processed or analyzed, and how many conclusions were drawn from those efforts. It's my opinion that our community should be advocating for transparency, open source solutions, and legislative policies designed to strike an appropriate balance between human rights and the needs of law enforcement, while also respecting national security. Basically, any government agency not part of the military acting in defense of the nation should be required to disclose vulnerabilities identified or used in criminal investigations using industry-recognized procedures and channels. So, with that said, occasionally I see questions posted like, can you defend against a Cellebrite? And clearly I like a challenge. So the answer is yes, but also very much no. So the easiest to deploy defenses are while the Android operating system is running. And I wrote an example application called Lockup to demonstrate how some of that could work. Generally speaking, though, I would not run anything like Lockup and expect to be safe from forensics tools, as that's unlikely to be the case, at least in the long term. Lockup specifically is designed as a userland application and as a proof of concept. It's designed to fail open, makes no attempt to hide itself, and is only meant to show that some defenses are possible, not to provide them in depth. The concept does not require root privilege, but does require the device admin privilege. It will start on boot, and it will defend against some of the techniques used by the UFED device, very much dependent upon what device you install it on. So how does it work? So basically, Lockup relies on broadcasts from the Android OS to decide when to take action. For example, when Mr. Mee See is installed, the certificate metadata for the application is compared against a list of known applications. And when it's detected, Lockup will automatically factory reset the device. A more covert approach would be to programmatically remove offending content or secret applications, but this is just a proof of concept. The same thought process also applies to the plausible deniability password. Keystrokes are logged through the accessibility service and only for the lock screen, and a predefined password being detected will result in a factory reset of the device as well. So let's take a demo of that. Let's see. There we go. All right, so I'll just pause real quick. So this is an older phone. I like to do all of my initial dev work with older devices. Makes things a little easier. Why is this not working? Okay, there we go. Seems like this is working or no? All right. Well, I'm not sure if that played or not, because as soon as I started playing, the computer went a little wonky. Let's try it again. All right. There we go. So back in the day, there was a bypass that in the emergency caller screen. Man, this is really failing. Here's it connecting. Here's the screen where it wants you to accept the key permanently. It's now trying to read from the device. And VLC is crashing. And extraction there, okay. So basically what happened here was the UFED attempted to connect through ADB, sideload in an application that could then run an evidence extraction process, and the APK was detected as being installed. The certificate metadata for that APK was compared against a list of known malicious applications, and the factory reset was then initiated. So that's kind of an initial idea of how lockup works. Let's see. All right, so future work. Oppose secrets like this being used in our justice system. Reverse Alohomora, which is kind of an interesting technical piece that I wasn't able to get reversed in time for this presentation. I'll probably work on developing a covert lockup, either as a set of patches to AOSP or Lineage OS. I'll look into reversing some of the other forensics tools on the market. I already have several of these in my inventory. And finally, Travis Goodspeed had a really interesting idea is using a special partition near the start of a disk to act as a trigger during block device reads. I'll probably look into that a little more, see if I can implement it. But that's the research that I have here for you today. I hope you found it interesting and thought-provoking. I want to take the time to thank Cellebrite, who helped patch these issues that we've talked about today. They definitely made a good faith effort to get some corrections made. And I'd like to thank my colleagues at CoreLogic, both in the publication and the advisory. And if you have any other questions or anything that you'd like to talk about, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or directly at my email address. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions. Sweet. Here's a good one. With an emphasis on mobile devices using technologies such as sandbox and virtual machines more often, are these kinds of tactics getting easier or harder to pull off? I would say that it's probably still around the same. The number of vulnerabilities being discovered, I think, is getting smaller over the long run in these types of targets. But the ones that are discovered usually are a little bit more damning, especially when you're going after boot ROM level vulnerabilities. So I would say that it's probably remaining consistent while the actual landscape of what is available to leverage is kind of shrinking. It was a great question. Thank you. Hopefully the demo worked out. If the demo was not easy to view for you for some reason, I know that the playing it kind of had some issues. I will make it available. You can reach me at level@corelogic.com. And there, check my LinkedIn in a couple of days. I may be able to post it publicly as well. Here's another one. You may have addressed this, but is iOS much harder for this type of analysis? I notice it's not listed here. Test results for image, JTAG, chip off decoding, and analysis tool, Cellebrite Universal Forensics. So I think it is harder for iOS devices, mostly because the closed source nature of the environment makes it a little bit more difficult for researchers to operate in. I know there are other tools now becoming available that seek to make it a more of a level playing field. I think one of them is called Corellium, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that. But there are steps being taken by the InfoSec industry to kind of even that playing field now.
Hey guys, if there are no more questions and everything's been addressed, we're going to go ahead and wrap this session up early a little bit. If that's all right with everybody.
I'm good. Thank you for joining, everybody. I appreciate your time and have a wonderful evening.